good afternoon, everybody. I hope that you had a good lunch. Welcome back to today's special session at the Conservation Symposium on Africa's Wildlife Economy. We are now moving into our third workshop for the day, which is on liberalizing trade in wildlife products. We have 4 talks in this workshop. They have all been pre-recorded. 2 of the people talking in the session are online with us, and 2 of them, Jeanette and Howard, are at the Conservation Symposium, but hopefully they'll be able to engage with us in the chat as well. The whole session is only 1 hour and 15 minutes, which means we will only have about 15 minutes at the end for question and discussion. So what I encourage you to do throughout the talks is to post your comments and questions in the chat so we can keep it nice and interactive. And I encourage the speakers to also engage with those comments in the chat, and then I will do a bit of a summary and we can have a discussion in the last 15 minutes. So we won't take questions at the end of each talk, rather put them in the chat, answer them in the chat, and then we'll have a discussion at the end. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Jeanetta Selier.
Good afternoon. Yesterday in a natural resource session, I spoke a little bit about conservation tools and how we need to add to the conservation toolbox rather than take tools out of the toolbox, and the role that the wildlife economy can play in helping us meet our biodiversity targets. So today I'm going to stand still a little bit with the wildlife, on the wildlife economy, and reflect backwards and where we came from. The lessons we've learned from the wildlife economy today, and in some of the challenges and opportunities we have going forward with the wildlife economy. Our legislative reform that happened around '94 with the drafting of the new constitution, that included a whole section on the environment, and also specifically the right to sustainable use of our natural resources, created the foundation for the wildlife economy in South Africa, and sustainable use has been incorporated in all of our legislative tools in the environmental sector. That including the promulgation of the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 Act that allow for conditional ownership of wildlife through obtaining a certificate of adequate enclosure, has basically started off our wildlife industry in South Africa. The right to be able to own wildlife, so adding an economic value to wildlife, the reduction in agricultural subsidies at the time, and then these two combined, created a growing understanding that wildlife ranching is both ecologically and financially sustainable. So today we have roughly 14,000 game farms. That basically includes an area of just over 1 million square kilometers, and commercial wildlife ranches basically include about 17% of our land surface. The industry is growing. In the past, about 6% per annum, probably a little bit less now, but there's still a limited understanding about the scale and scope of the industry. Trade is also very important within this industry, both on a local level as well as international, and we have various products that we export or import. Photographic tourism, tourists that come to South Africa, exporting their photographs, trophy hunters and trophies in the entire value chain around trophy hunting, the export of live animals either for the pet trade, for reintroduction, for zoos and breeding facilities, and of course all the products that are being exported, curios, bones, ivory, rhino horn and hippo teeth, to just name a few. So just to give you an idea of the extent of this trade, we have over 800 plant taxa that are listed on CITES, and then just under 500 South African animal species that are listed on the CITES appendices. And bear in mind that these are only threatened species that are being listed. So not all species that we trade in is listed in CITES, and there are many mammal trophies or mammals that we trophy hunt that are not listed on CITES. A few years back in 2016, Srinivas and colleagues did a review of the key commodities that SADC, the Southern African countries, trade, and also the main destination countries for these commodities. From an animal perspective, the key commodities were the live bird trade, then all the products around the Nile crocodile, elephant tusks or ivory, as well as mammal trophies. Those were the key things that we were exporting from South Africa at the time. So this shows the importance of trophy hunting as a commercial activity within the wildlife economy. From SADC, we basically, during that time, so 2005 to 2014, exported roughly 180,000 animals, of which 65% were mammals, that were exported as trophies. So South Africa being the main exporter, roughly 33% of all trophies. And the revenue generated through trophy hunting for sub-Saharan Africa at the time were roughly $200 million. So trophy hunting, we know that when it's well managed, do contribute to species conservation as well as habitat conservation. But we also know that there are some concerns, and that's especially where it's not well managed and we have inequitable distribution of hunting revenues, and where there's insufficient resources to monitor populations or to establish sustainable harvest levels, and where there's limited transparency in how the funding flows through the value chain. The industry has had an enormous positive contribution to biodiversity conservation over the past years, and specifically when we look at species population numbers, we've seen a massive increase at present. Although the initial increase in growing of rhino numbers were within our state protected areas, once we've handed it over to the private sectors, they've continued with growing our rhino population. At present, more than 50% of all white rhino is on private ownership within South Africa. There's been an increase in land under biodiversity compatible land uses, and the industry has contributed significantly in rewilding old agricultural landscapes and improving the ecological infrastructure within these areas. So converting to wildlife-based land uses also increases the residual grass productivity, despite most of these properties being on marginal land, and this can be considered an ecosystem-based adaptation. But for this, to gain this, we really do need our sustainable use models in providing the economic incentive to do all of this. The industry has contributed to increased economic activity in our rural provinces, and as such has contributed greatly to our GDP. The work that Haley Clements and the team has done has also shown that our landowners are highly adaptable. They have very diverse business models, and this allows a variability in how they respond to crises such as the COVID crisis we recently experienced. But of course, there are always risks, and risks are really around the perverse economic incentives that could lead, and in the past have led, to negative conservation outcomes. For example, the intensification of our wildlife, where we intensively breed specific species and breed them for specific phenotypic features. The color variant saga that are well known and the impacts that had on biodiversity and species conservation, as well as our reputation. And then of course, when species have a rapid increase in value, for example, sable and roan, the tolerance toward predators decreases, in offtake of a single specimen of a species can have a huge economic impact. Regulations and over-regulating, bans, trade restrictions, all can negatively impact both on the industry as well as biodiversity. And yesterday I showed an example of the Cape Mountain zebra, where these trade restrictions basically led to a reduction in the value of the species, and the species now being replaced by a counterpart that's easier to trade with where there's less restrictions, less permitting, and we lose, and as such, we're also losing land for that specific species. It can also lead to complete land use changes where it's too difficult to be part of a biodiversity friendly land use, and a landholder would just move back to a land use that may not be compatible with biodiversity. And where we have species, commodities that are high in demand, but where there's very strict trade restrictions or bans, it's likely that those commodities will move to the illegal trade, where we obviously have no ability to regulate or to monitor, and that can have very detrimental impacts on the species conservation. There are also a number of challenges, and specifically related to the desertification of Africa, that undermines the expansion of our wildlife economy in Africa. We need to rethink our framing and think and consider a more agroecological framing that could promote, promotes a sustainable use of wildlife and then creates these viable wildlife-based land uses. We need a broader and better understanding also, especially in the global north, of the wildlife economy model that's used within South Africa and the benefits derived for biodiversity conservation and rural development. And then there's also fundamental challenges in applying the OECM framework to wildlife ranches, and this can have significant implications for achieving the intended outcomes of the OECMs, as well as the Kunming Montreal 2023 targets. There are also huge opportunities for the wildlife economy in South Africa, and that is specifically around the legislation and the regulations, and finding that framework that incentivizes landowners to be part of to make use of a biodiversity-friendly land use and to do things the right way. So here you're specifically thinking about the role that incentives and certification schemes can play in creating that enabling environment that's needed to take the wildlife economy forward, and also to incentivize new entrants into the wildlife economy to form part of this economy. The potential for impact is immense. We know that already private wildlife-based land uses are greater than the area of formal conservation areas. That there is the end goal to add another 10 million hectares to the wildlife land by 2030. So this collectively already constitutes 35% of South Africa's natural and near natural ecosystems. But then there's also the potential to incorporate agricultural land into this space, with the commitment from the Department of Agriculture to add roughly 700,000 hectares of agricultural land and give that to the local to communities for agriculture. So there's again where wildlife ranching can play a very important role, and land transformation, and specifically so under the current climate change models, where traditional agriculture will become less and less viable. We also need to consider the role that mixed farms can play as a strategic land use within our wildlife economy space, and really start thinking around government programs that initially can focus on helping new market entrants to establish mixed cattle and wildlife enterprises to address a local hunting and game meat market, and then to develop more impactful infrastructure and skills development investments. And if we look at wildlife-based land uses, they are more seen as regenerative agricultural activities and less as protected areas. We will be able to actually obtain the appropriate support across government departments for communities to develop resilient and viable agroecological enterprises. So in conclusion, our constitution informs the model of sustainable use that South Africa applies, and this is really based on providing conditional ownership to a landholder that increases the value of wildlife and actually allows for wildlife-based land uses to be a competitive land use, especially under dry land conditions. The model has worked across Southern Africa, which holds the largest populations of several of the charismatic and non-charismatic species. It's a vibrant and growing sector that contributes significantly to our economy, but is an economic-based industry, and its main objective is not conservation. But conservation can be a positive secondary outcome of these land use practices. So we should rather view our wildlife as assets to be deployed in these socioeconomic systems rather than populations in need of protection. Key to this is recognizing the value of these novel ecosystems, especially mixed wildlife and cattle ecosystems. There are risks to the industry, and there's also risks that the industry poses to biodiversity. Our industry is dependent on trade, and risk to trade is risk to the industry and ultimately be risk to biodiversity. But these can be mitigated by smarter regulations and a greater focus on international buy-in. The diversity and adaptive capacity of ranchers should be something that policy supports. Though we also need to recognize that ranchers can also adapt in ways that aren't desired. So we need our policies to incentivize the right kind of adaptation. We need to build communities of practice and institutions that can mobilize the required data, build the knowledge products, and provide a global South voice on wildlife such as the global North does not erode the markets for our sustainable wildlife products. Thank you very much.